In this question, we're asked to find the zeros of the function g of x equals x squared minus x minus 2. Well, note that the zeros of the function are also known as the x-intercepts, or where the graph crosses the x-axis at. So in order to find where the x-intercept is, we let g of x equals 0 and solve for x. So what we have to do is set, well, g of x is equal to 0 is equal to x squared minus x minus 2. Well, now we can solve for x. In some cases, we might be able to factor. Either we reverse FOIL, find greatest common factor, or factor by grouping if we can. In this case, it's easy enough to do a reverse FOIL method. So we can factor out, since we have a quadratic, we set up two binomials. We find the factors of x squared and put them in the first part of the parentheses. And then we find the factors of negative 2 such that when we add them together we would get negative 1. Well, the factors of negative 2 are negative 2 and positive 1, or negative 1 and positive 2. But I want that negative, so the higher number has to have that negative. So the negative 2 plus 1. Now I can always check my work, and you should double check to make sure that you've got it correct. And you can do that by using the distributive property, or FOILing out. So we have x times x, that's x squared. We have the outside term as x times 1, which is 1x. Inside term is negative 2x. Well, negative 2x plus 1x is negative x. And then the last term, negative 2 times 1 is negative 2. From this point, we need to set each of these equations equal to 0. So each of these factors is set equal to 0. It's like setting up a mini equation. So we have two of them. X minus 2 equals 0, and x plus 1 equals 0. So when we solve these mini equations for x, we should get two answers. X is equal to 2, and subtracting 1, we'll get x is equal to negative 1. Well, this is where on the graph, if we were to graph, we would go through the point 2, 0 on the Cartesian plane, or on graph paper. And we would also go through x is equal to negative 1, so the point would be negative 1, 0. Well, if I didn't know how to factor this out, since it is a quadratic, we could use what's called the quadratic equation. And the quadratic equation, as long as we're in a quadratic format, so as long as we're in the format of x squared, or ax squared, whatever a is, plus bx, plus c equaling 0, a, b, and c are just numbers, positive and negative. As long as we're in that form, which our equation is, we have x squared minus x minus 2 equaling 0, we can factor out and find the values of a. Well, a in our case, remember, is x squared minus x minus 2 equaling 0. Well, in our case, a is equal to 1, because it's the coefficient in front of the x squared term. B is negative 1, because that's the coefficient in front of the x term. And c in our example is negative 2, because that's all by itself. So now that we have that, we can use the quadratic equation. Well, the quadratic equation says that x is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, that's all in the square root sign there, all over 2 times a. So now what we have to do is, we know our values of a, b, and c, we just plug them in wherever we see that in the quadratic equation. So I see I have a negative, and then b, I just plug in b, we said that was negative 1. So you have to be careful there, because it's going to turn into positive 1 when we simplify down. B squared, that's going to be negative 1, and square it. And we have a is 1 and c is negative 2. All over, so that's all over 2 times a, which is just 1. So when we simplify this down, remember, negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. And then we have, well, negative 1 squared is 1. And then a negative times a 1 is negative 4. Times a negative 2 is a positive 8. And then 2 times 1 is 2. Well, I can simplify the square root of 1 plus 8, that's 9. Well, the square root of 9 is really 3, so I'm left with x is equal to 1 plus or minus 3 all over 2. Well, now with this quadratic equation, I get two answers. One's going to be 1 plus 3 over 2, so I'm going to have two answers, 1 plus 3 over 2, and I'm going to have 1 minus 3 over 2. Oops. So when I simplify this down, 1 plus 3, that's 4, and 4 divided by 2 is 2. And then I also simplify 1 minus 3, well that's negative 2 over 2, well that's just negative 1. So I really get the same answers as what I've got before. So the final answer is x is equal to 2 and x is equal to negative 1. So again, it still goes through the coordinate and the Cartesian plane or graph paper at the point 2, 0 and at negative 1, 0.